There is a war most Americans have never heard of, fought on a coastline most Americans could not find on a map, by men whose surnames have all but disappeared from the history books their descendants were handed in school. The Barbary Wars, America's first overseas military conflict. A campaign launched not against a European empire, not against a neighboring nation, but against the Corsair states of North Africa, Tripoli, Algiers, Tunis, and Morocco, who had spent decades seizing American merchant ships and enslaving their crews. The men who sailed into those waters, and the men who marched overland through the Libyan desert, carried names that appear in the muster rolls of the early republic with a frequency that genealogists have only recently begun to map against the surname distributions of modern American families. Some of those names are still common, some changed spelling across generations of clerical approximation and family decision-making, some vanished entirely from the accessible record after the men who bore them were killed, captured, or simply never came home. And some of those names, when traced backward through the census and forward through the DNA evidence, reveal origins that the families themselves were never told. Origins that survived not in the documents that were burned or misfiled or deliberately altered, but in the genome itself, where no assimilation officer and no census taker ever had jurisdiction. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The First Barbary War began in 1801, when Thomas Jefferson, newly inaugurated and already confronting a national humiliation that had dragged on for nearly 2 decades, refused to pay further tribute to the Pasha of Tripoli. For years, the young United States had been buying the safety of its merchant fleet with payments that the Barbary states treated as acknowledgement of their dominance, as the price of operating in waters they considered their own. When the payments stopped, Tripoli declared war. Jefferson sent ships. What followed was a naval campaign that lasted 4 years and produced a generation of officers whose names, Preble, Decatur, Eaton, Hull, Summers, became shorthand for a particular brand of American resolve that the national story has been retelling ever since. But those names belonged to the officers. The muster rolls of the enlisted men, the ordinary sailors and marines who crewed the frigates and stormed the harbor fortifications and spent months as prisoners in the dungeons of Tripoli, contain a different kind of archive. Names from the Scots-Irish communities of the Appalachian Backcountry, names from the German immigrant settlements of Pennsylvania and the Carolinas, names from the free black maritime communities of New England and the Chesapeake, names that carry, for those who know how to read them against the DNA evidence now available through commercial genealogical testing, a record of origin that the official history of the conflict has never fully assembled. The surname Eaton itself is instructive, not because William Eaton the general is the central subject here, but because the community from which he drew his overland force reveals the complexity that lies beneath the simple national story the country has preferred to tell about this war. Eaton's march from Alexandria to Derna in 1805, the overland campaign that produced the line about the shores of Tripoli in the Marine Corps hymn, was carried out by a force that included United States Marines, Greek mercenaries, Arab cavalry, and a contingent of men whose national and ethnic origins the official record describes in terms that do not quite hold together under genealogical examination. The muster rolls record them as they were catalogued in the moment. The DNA evidence of their descendants suggests something considerably more layered than the records indicate. To understand why these surnames matter, it helps to understand the specific economic and social geography that produced the men who fought. The American Republic of 1801 was a country whose white male population was concentrated along 2 corridors, the Atlantic seaboard cities and ports, and the Appalachian backcountry that stretched from western Pennsylvania south through Virginia and into the Carolinas and Tennessee. The men who enlisted in the Navy during the Barbary War period were drawn overwhelmingly from these 2 populations, because those were the populations with the fewest alternatives. The coastal cities offered maritime employment as a matter of course, and the Navy paid more reliably than the merchant fleet. The backcountry offered subsistence agriculture and very little cash, so military service was one of the only ways a young man could accumulate enough money to buy land or pay a debt. The surnames in the muster rolls reflect this geography precisely. And what those surnames reveal, when mapped against the DNA evidence that their descendants are now generating, is that both of those corridors carried genetic histories that the enlistment record had neither the vocabulary nor the incentive to capture with accuracy. The surnames that appear most frequently across the full Barbary War documentary record, the naval enlistment rolls, the Marine Corps muster books, Eaton's expedition roster, the prisoner lists from Tripoli, and the pension applications filed by veterans and their widows in the decades after the conflict fall into several distinct clusters, each of which points toward a specific migration corridor and a specific history of what was recorded and what was not. The first cluster is the most expected, surnames of British Isles origin, carried to America by the Scots-Irish migration of the mid-18th century, which deposited these families along the spine of the Appalachian Mountains from Pennsylvania south through Virginia, the Carolinas, and into Tennessee and Kentucky. Names like Caldwell, Montgomery, McCulloch, and Stewart appear in the naval enlistment records of the early Republic with a regularity that reflects the disproportionate military participation of the Scots-Irish communities in every armed conflict the young nation undertook. These were families who had already fought in the Revolution, and before that in the border wars of the Scottish lowlands and the plantation settlements of Ulster. They had pushed into the American frontier precisely because they were accustomed to displacement and because the backcountry economy offered them what they had been chasing for generations: land. Naval service was one of the few reliable paths to the cash wages that the land alone could not provide. Their descendants, when they appear in the DNA databases today, consistently show the haplogroup signatures associated with the Atlantic coast of Europe, the paternal line haplogroup RM269 and its subclades, which trace the movement of people from the British Isles into the American interior. That part of the story matches the official record. What does not match is what appears alongside it in the same family results, percentages and haplogroup designations that the standard Scots-Irish genealogical narrative has no room for and no explanation to offer. The second cluster of surnames in the Barbary War muster rolls is less expected and considerably harder to explain within the framework of the conventional genealogical account. These are names that carry Germanic roots, not always the anglicized forms that many German immigrant families adopted under the assimilation pressures of the 19th century, but the original forms, recorded in phonetic approximations that American naval clerks used when they encountered names they could not spell with confidence in English. Families named Hartman, recorded as Hartman, families named Muller, recorded as Miller, or simply Mueller, depending on the clerk and the port of enlistment. Families named Brower, recorded as Brower or Brewer, or, in one Baltimore enlistment record from 1802, as Breyer. The German-speaking communities of Pennsylvania and the Shenandoah Valley contributed heavily to the early American military because their men faced the same economic pressures as the Scots-Irish: land scarcity, debt cycles, and the need for reliable cash income that subsistence farming on the frontier could not consistently provide. But the Germanic surnames in the Barbary War records carry an additional layer of complexity that the genealogical record has been slow to examine directly. Some of those names do not trace back to the Rhine Valley or the Palatinate in the way the family stories claim. Some of them trace, through the port records of Hamburg and Bremen and the passenger manifests of the late 17th and early 18th century, to communities of Jewish origin who had adopted Germanic surnames as part of the assimilation pressure that followed the expulsion edicts and residency restrictions of the preceding centuries. These were families of Ashkenazi origin who arrived in the German states as refugees, took German names to navigate a society that required it, and then joined the streams of German-speaking emigrants who crossed the Atlantic looking for the same thing every other group was looking for: a place where the past could be set down and a different story could begin. The DNA evidence for this is not conclusive at the individual level, where a single test result cannot be read as proof of any specific ancestral narrative. At the population level, the pattern is harder to dismiss. The Ashkenazi Jewish genetic signature, a cluster of markers that geneticists have identified with considerable precision because of the founder effect that shaped the Ashkenazi population through centuries of endogamy and geographic isolation, appears in the descendants of certain Germanic surnames from the Barbary War muster rolls at a frequency that exceeds what random variation would predict for families whose documented history contains no Jewish ancestry at all. This does not mean that every Miller or Hartman or Brewer in those records was of Jewish origin. It means that some of them were, and that the families who carried that origin across the Atlantic and into the American interior were navigating, from the moment of their arrival, a social environment that had powerful structural incentives to encourage the abandonment of that history. The story of the Celtic Germanic frontier settler was a story the country wanted and rewarded. The story of the Ashkenazi refugee who had been moving across European borders for 2 centuries before arriving in Pennsylvania was a story with no comfortable place in the national mythology of westward expansion and settlement. The third cluster is the one that the official history of the Barbary Wars has been most reluctant to examine directly. The free black maritime communities of the early American Republic were among the most active participants in the naval economy of the Atlantic coast. The ports of New Bedford, Providence, Baltimore, and Norfolk contained large populations of free black sailors who worked the merchant fleet and, when the Navy needed men, filled the enlistment roles alongside white sailors in a kind of practical integration that the racial politics of the 19th century would later make invisible, and that the historical narrative of the early republic has been slow to recover. The surnames these men carried into the Barbary War record are, in many cases, the surnames of former enslavers, the common naming pattern of the post-emancipation period in which freed people took the surnames of the families who had held them. But in some cases, the surnames in the free black maritime enlistment records are something else entirely. There are names in those rolls that do not follow the pattern of enslaver surnames at all. Names that appear to carry Iberian origin, Portuguese and Spanish forms that arrived in the Chesapeake and New England port communities through routes the standard genealogical narrative has never satisfactorily mapped. The surname Fonseca appears in the records of the Baltimore free black community in the early 19th century. So does Cardozo, so does Pereira. These are Sephardic Jewish surnames, carried originally from the Iberian Peninsula, dispersed by the expulsions of 1492 and 1497 into the communities of Portugal, the Netherlands, and West Africa, and carried from there into the Atlantic maritime world that connected the African coast to the Caribbean to the ports of the American Republic. What the DNA evidence shows, when the descendants of families bearing these surnames submit results to genealogical databases, is a haplogroup profile that contains both the sub-Saharan African markers that the family history accounts for and the Sephardic Jewish genetic signature that traces back to the Iberian Peninsula through the North African and West African Jewish communities that the Atlantic trade routes brought into contact with American port cities across the 18th and early 19th century. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The families themselves, in most cases, have no record of this history. The connection was severed, or buried so deeply in oral tradition that it survived only as a hint, a whisper at a family reunion that nobody wrote down, a surname that appeared in one generation and disappeared into a differently spelled version in the next. The Barbary War muster rolls preserve, in many cases, the last clearly legible trace of these surnames before they disappear into the phonetic approximations and racial reclassifications of the 19th century census record, before the family decided, or was forced to decide, that survival required a different account of where they came from. The Overland campaign that William Eaton led from Alexandria to Derna in 1805 produced a separate layer of surnames and a separate genealogical complication that the standard account of the war has largely set aside. The force that Eaton assembled in Egypt included, alongside the Marines and American naval personnel, a substantial contingent of men recruited from the Greek and Arab communities of the eastern Mediterranean. Some of those men, when the diplomatic settlement ended the campaign and made their continued service unnecessary, did not return to their places of origin. They remained in the Mediterranean ports where American naval vessels called, and over the following years made their way to the United States through the networks of maritime employment that connected the Mediterranean to the American Atlantic coast. The surnames these men adopted upon arrival were often phonetic renderings of their original names, approximated by immigration officials or naturalization clerks into something that sounded familiar enough to process and record. A Greek sailor whose name bore no resemblance to anything in the English surname inventory might arrive in Baltimore or New Orleans as something the clerk could spell and the sailor could learn to answer to. The trail from that arrival to the DNA results of a modern descendant runs through exactly the kind of phonetic drift and identity adjustment that has made these connections so difficult to trace through documents alone. The haplogroup JM172, which traces the ancient movement of populations from the Fertile Crescent and the eastern Mediterranean, appears in the descendants of certain American families whose surnames carry no obvious Mediterranean origin, families who believe themselves to be entirely of British or German stock, but whose paternal line DNA tells a story that begins in a geography the family narrative has never named. Some of those families, when they trace the paper trail back as far as the documents allow, find that the trail ends in the port cities of the early 19th century, in the period of the Barbary Wars, in the muster rolls and enlistment records of a conflict their ancestors fought under a flag they were still in the process of learning to claim. What happened between the moment those men stepped off a vessel in Baltimore or New Orleans and the moment their descendants uploaded a DNA sample to a genealogical database is a story of assimilation so complete that the only thing it could not reach was the genome. The census record adjusted, the surname adjusted, the family story adjusted, the haplogroup did not. The pension applications filed after the war are among the most revealing documents the conflict produced, and among the least examined for the genealogical complexity they contain. Filed in the decades after the war by aging veterans or the widows of men who had died in service, they contain physical descriptions, birthplace claims, and family relationship statements that the muster rolls alone do not provide. A pension application from a veteran who listed himself as born in Pennsylvania, but whose physical description includes features that the application's language struggles to categorize without invoking the racial classification vocabulary of the period, is a genealogical document of considerable depth, provided someone reads it against the DNA evidence rather than accepting its self-classification at face value. The classification the document offers was the classification that made survival possible in the social environment of the time. The genome holds the fuller account. When a family with a German surname and a Pennsylvania birthplace in the pension record returns DNA results that cluster with Ashkenazi Jewish reference populations, the pension application is not wrong. It is telling the story the family needed to tell in 1822. The genome is telling the story that began several centuries before that. What the Barbary Wars produced, beyond the naval precedents and the political settlements, was a single documented moment in which men of extraordinarily varied origin appeared together under one flag, in one record, before dispersing into the westward-moving republic that immediately began sorting them into categories that the muster rolls themselves had not enforced. The prisoner lists from Tripoli are particularly striking in this regard. The Americans captured when the frigate Philadelphia ran aground in 1803 and was taken by Tripolitan forces included men whose surnames, when mapped against the migration records and the DNA evidence, represent a cross-section of the Atlantic world that the early republic was not prepared to acknowledge as such. Those men spent nearly 2 years as prisoners. They came home to a country that celebrated their survival and did not ask too many questions about the full complexity of what they had carried across the ocean with them. The prisoner lists from Tripoli are particularly striking in this regard. The Americans captured when the frigate Philadelphia ran aground in 1803 and was taken by Tripolitan forces included men whose surnames, when mapped against the migration records and the DNA evidence, represent a cross-section of the Atlantic world that the early republic was not prepared to acknowledge as such. Those men spent nearly 2 years as captives in Tripoli before a ransom was negotiated, and they were returned to the United States. They came home to a country that celebrated their survival, commissioned paintings of their ordeal, and printed accounts of their captivity that were read widely in the eastern seaboard cities. What those accounts do not contain, because the conventions of the captivity narrative genre had no room for it, is an accurate account of who those men actually were. The published narratives describe Americans. The muster rolls describe men with names. The DNA of their descendants describes something more specific and more complex than either. Among the surnames of the Philadelphia prisoners, several appear in the records of the mid-Atlantic free black communities of the same period. Several others appear in the passenger manifests of German immigrant ships with annotations suggesting non-Protestant religious affiliation, a detail that the clerks noted because it affected the legal status of the arriving passenger in certain colonies and, after independence, in certain states. The annotations are not always explicit, but their presence in the same documents as the surnames that later appear in the Barbary War prisoner lists is the kind of convergence that genealogists describe as a pattern worth following. The Second Barbary War, which came in 1815, after the Napoleonic conflicts had weakened the European powers that had been informally policing the Mediterranean, added another layer to this genealogical record. American naval forces under Stephen Decatur moved quickly. The war lasted weeks rather than years, but the enlistment records of that campaign reflect the demographic changes that had taken place in the intervening decade. The port cities of the Atlantic coast had continued to receive immigrants throughout the early 19th century, and the naval enlistment rolls of 1815 include surnames that were not present in the rolls of 1801, names of Irish origin, reflecting the early wave of Irish immigration that preceded the mass emigration of the famine years. Names of French origin, carried to American ports by the Haitian refugees who had fled the revolution of the preceding decade and settled in New Orleans, Baltimore, and Philadelphia in numbers large enough to shift the demographic character of those cities measurably. and names that appear to be creolized forms, surnames that carry the traces of French and African and Caribbean origin in phonetic combinations that the enlistment clerks rendered in whatever approximation they could manage. The families who carried those names into the naval record of the Second Barbary War and then dispersed into the American interior in the following decades left a genealogical trail that is, in many cases, as difficult to reconstruct through documents as the trail left by their predecessors. The DNA evidence is the same kind of partial corrective, not proof but pattern, not conclusion but a direction in which to look. The names that cluster around the prisoner lists, the Stuarts and Caldwells of the Backcountry, the Millers and Hartmans of the Pennsylvania German communities, the Maritime surnames of the Chesapeake Free Black community, were not randomly distributed across the crew of the Philadelphia. They reflect the specific enlistment patterns of the port where the ship was commissioned and the communities from which the Navy drew its men in that period. Reading those names against the DNA results of families who share them today and against the haplogroup distributions that those results reveal is not a matter of claiming proof. It is a matter of assembling the pattern until the pattern becomes too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. The official history of the Philadelphia's capture and the ransom of its crew is a story about American resilience and diplomatic resolve. The genealogical history of the men who were on that ship is a story about the full complexity of who the early American Republic actually contained. The geographic dispersal of Barbary War veterans after the conflicts ended followed the major migration corridors of the early 19th century in ways that genealogists can trace with some precision through the land patent records and the census entries of the expansion period. Veterans who had enlisted from Baltimore and Philadelphia moved west through the National Road Corridor into Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, carrying their surnames into the Midwest. Veterans who had enlisted from the Carolina backcountry moved south and west through the Cumberland Gap and into Tennessee and Kentucky, and eventually into Alabama and Mississippi, following the same routes their families had taken a generation earlier when they first came down from Pennsylvania. Veterans who had enlisted from New England ports moved north and west into the Great Lakes region. The surname clusters that appear in the Barbary War muster rolls reappear, in their drifted and altered forms, in the census records of these destination states in the 1820s and 1830s. The connection between the muster roll entry and the census entry is, in most cases, what a genealogist would call a reasonable inference rather than a proven link. The DNA evidence is what turns a reasonable inference into something that warrants serious attention. When a family whose surname appears in both the Barbary War record and the Ohio census of 1830 returns DNA results that include haplogroup markers inconsistent with their documented ancestry, the two data points together, the surname migration and the genetic anomaly, constitute the beginning of a real investigation rather than a speculation. The community of genealogists currently working through the Barbary War records is smaller than the community working on more celebrated conflicts, which means the documentary work is less advanced, and the connections between the muster rolls and the DNA databases are less thoroughly mapped. What has been established is enough to demonstrate that the standard accounts of who fought in this war and where they came from were, at the very least, incomplete. The men in those muster rolls were not the homogeneous population of Anglo-Saxon and Scots-Irish Protestant settlers that the 19th century mythology of the early Republic preferred to describe. They were the actual population of the early American port cities and backcountry communities, which was considerably more varied than the mythology allowed. The surnames they carried reflect that variety. The DNA of their descendants confirms it. And the gap between what the muster rolls recorded and what the genome contains is a gap that was created deliberately, maintained deliberately, and is now, for the first time, becoming possible to close. Not completely, not with the kind of certainty that would satisfy a court of law, but with enough precision to ask different questions about who these men were and what they carried across the ocean and back. The 46 surnames that appear with the greatest frequency across the Barbary War documentary record form a map of early American ethnic complexity that the national memory of this conflict has never fully absorbed. The names include Caldwell and Stuart and Montgomery, carrying their Scots-Irish genetics into the naval record and from there into the westward migration. They include Hartman and Brewer and Muller, carrying their Germanic origins, and in some branches of those families, their older and unreported origins concealed within the Germanic exterior. They include surnames whose origins are not European in any simple sense. surnames that carry in their phonetic structure and their distribution pattern the traces of the free black maritime community, the Sephardic Jewish trading diaspora of the Atlantic world, and the Eastern Mediterranean communities that Eaton's campaign brought into direct contact with the United States for the first and, in some cases, the only documented moment in those families' connection to American history. These surnames survive. Some of them survive in the families that still bear them, families who have been told a simple story about where they came from, and who are only now, through the DNA evidence that no census taker could alter and no family decision to pass could erase, beginning to understand the complexity of what they carry. Some of the names survive only in the archive, in the muster rolls and pension records and prisoner lists that genealogists are still working through, matching names to DNA results, tracing the dispersal of families whose connection to the Barbary Wars was the last moment before the record closed over them and the silence began. The genome does not forget what the family was told to stop saying. The haplogroup does not change because a clerk spelled a surname differently, or because a family decided, somewhere in the long passage between 1805 and the present day, that certain things were better left unspoken. The Barbary Wars put these men into the historical record for one documented moment, and what the DNA shows, for the descendants who are still looking, is that the bloodlines those men carried have been present in American families ever since, waiting for a science precise enough to read what the paper trail was never permitted to say. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.